negate, resolves, the U.S. federal government should prioritize reducing the national debt over promoting economic growth. We observe the most important aspect of the national debt is not the size itself, but how large it is compared to the size of the economy. As long as economic growth outpaces debt growth, the U.S. will be able to pay down the debt. This will continue to happen for two reasons, and the first is that borrowing costs will go down. Interest rates on Treasury bonds have been falling for decades and will keep falling, meaning we can simply borrow to make interest payments, and the ratio of debt to GDP will still decline. That's important because lower interest rates makes it much easier for the U.S. to finance the debt. David Wessel of the Brookings Institute explained in 2019 that if interest rates on federal debt were just 1 percentage point lower during the next 30 years, federal debt would be smaller by more than 30% of GDP at the end of that period. Second, the economy will grow. Historically, economic growth paid down the debt, like how strong economic performance after World War II led the debt to GDP ratio to plunge. The U.S. will soon experience a new period of massive growth. Seth Redmore at Lexelites writes in 2017 that artificial intelligence will drive unprecedented economic growth, nearly doubling GDP levels in the next 20 years by increasing productivity. AI may be the single greatest economic growth factor in history. This will make paying off the debt much easier. Thomas Frank of CNBC writes in 2017, if artificial intelligence expands its capabilities, then dealing with debt could become a lot easier. Tireless robots would make our economy more productive, which would boost economic growth, giving us more money for paying down the debt. Thus, there is no need to prioritize debt reduction in order to achieve manageable debt levels. Trying to do so would only increase economic pain. Thus, our sole contention is entitlement cuts. If the federal government does prioritize debt reduction, it would have to cut entitlement spending, since it accounts for the lion's share of debt increases. Michael Tanner writes in the National Review in 2018 that while tax cuts will add about $1.85 trillion to the debt over a decade, increased spending will add around $12 trillion to debt over the next 10 years. Half of all federal spending is on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the cost of all three programs is accelerating. A combination of an aging population and rising healthcare costs means that Medicare is expected to grow by as much as 7% per year. Quite simply, there is no way to reduce spending without reforming these programs. Slashing these programs would create a downward economic spiral where people lose money, spend less, and slow the economy. In just the example of Social Security, Brian Covert of Think Progress writes in 2013 that the program keeps 26.6 million people out of poverty. This would plunge the economy into slowdown. Randall Wray, a professor of economics at University of Missouri, Kansas, writes in 2010 that with the exception of the Clinton surpluses, every significant reduction of the outstanding debt has been followed by a depression. Not only do entitlement cuts create the conditions for an economic slump, but they also make it more difficult to climb out of one. Robert Rubin of the Washington Post writes in 2017 that these programs serve as automatic stabilizers during an economic downturn. In a weak economy, as people lose more income and become eligible for federal benefits, the programs expand, putting more money in people's pockets. People then spend that money, increasing demand and helping the economy recover. If the federal government cuts entitlement programs during or right before a recession, it would be shooting itself in the foot by weakening that safety net. This was confirmed in the last recession when the US government strengthened these programs, but European governments made deep cuts to try to lower the debt. The US economy has recovered much faster because it supported these programs. Francis Coppola of Forbes explains in 2018 that in Europe, the result has been a decades-long slump. Some countries in Europe still have unemployment to double digits. An entire generation has been thrown on that scrap heap in the name of balancing the books. Thus, we negate. One more.
Hi, I'm Straya, we're Corona del Sol, and I would first like to thank Emory for holding such a great tournament. We're honored to be in finals here. And then I would like to thank my parents for supporting me and allowing me to debate and travel a lot the last 2 years especially. And probably most importantly, thank you to Ryan Jang and his family. He's the best partner I could probably ask for as a novice, and a simple thank you isn't enough for my gratitude. But then I would like to thank Brophy and Corey Lane and all of the friends and acquaintances I've met through this activity. It's been a big blessing, so thank you. And thank you to Polly and Kat for being our opponents in this round. I hope this round is really fun. Thank you to Kale for being probably the most dedicated coach everyone could ask for. This wouldn't be possible without all of his help and support. And so with that, we affirm, resolve the United States federal government should prioritize reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. Our sole contention is the developing debt disaster. The developing world is facing an impending debt crisis. More 18 of the Atlantic Council writes that both Turkey and Argentina are set to experience a recession, and if no action is taken, these two countries could default on their debt, triggering widespread investor panic. Beyond these two countries, Zumbra 18 of the Wall Street Journal writes, the risk of a global crisis is rapidly rising, as over 45% of low-income countries are at a high risk of default, up from just 25% from 5 years ago. With comparatively poor levels of infrastructural development and high social stratification, these defaults would push millions into poverty. For example, NERD 14 of the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research articulates that when a similar crisis broke out in 1997, the living standards of millions plummeted and countries lost years of economic development in an instant. At the heart of this looming disaster is the American debt crisis. When America borrows more money, it does so by selling more bonds. Patel 18 of the Financial Times explains that to fund the rapidly increasing deficit, the American government issued over $1 trillion of government bonds in 2018, flooding the global bond market with American treasuries. This flood of treasury bonds has created the developing world's debt catastrophe in two ways. First, by reversing investment flows. Compretta 18 of the American Enterprise Institute emphasizes that just as American debt has exploded, so too is the supply of U.S. Treasury bonds. To global lenders, U.S. bonds represent the safest asset on the market, meaning with more American treasuries available for purchase, the supply of lenders for emerging markets has gone down dramatically as they shift to buy more U.S. bonds. Indeed, Patel 18 of the Financial Times continues that already emerging economies are losing over $5 billion a week in investment due to the high levels of U.S. debt. Problematically, Edwards 18 of Business Insider writes that as the global supply of capital shifts away from emerging markets and towards U.S. Treasury bonds, it becomes impossible for markets like Turkey to find the lenders to finance their debt, pushing countries to the brink of default. Second, by amplifying dollar-denominated debt. Hicks 18 of U.S. News writes that when the government issues more bonds to pay for the federal debt, interest rates on Treasury bonds skyrocket because the demand for loans rises. Indeed, Sebula 14 of Jacksonville University analyzes rates in America from 1971 to 2012, concluding that for every 1% increase in the U.S. deficit has resulted in a 0.21% increase in interest rates on Treasury bonds. When interest rates in America rise in America, they amplify the debt problems of emerging markets. Bartonside 18 of Bloomberg explicates that over 2/3 of debt held by emerging markets is dollar-denominated, meaning that these countries are borrowing in dollars, not their own currencies. Unfortunately, Sasser 18 of the Foreign Affairs magazine explains that higher U.S. interest rates cause lenders to hike the interest rates on bonds in emerging markets since they would need a higher return of investment in order to compete with the safer American treasuries. Overall, Forney 11 of the International Monetary Fund quantifies this effect, finding every 1% increase in the debt-to-GDP ratio in the U.S. results in a 0.1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. Higher interest rates are devastating to these economies. Richter 18 of Business Insider writes that through 2025, emerging markets will face $2.7 trillion in U.S.-denominated debt that has to be paid off. So higher borrowing costs would make it significantly harder for countries to pay off its debt and heighten the risk that these countries default. By prioritizing the reduction of federal debt, the American government would necessarily borrow less, putting fewer treasuries on the market. A vote for the AF prevents investors from fleeing emerging markets and drives down interest rates, thus making debt much more manageable for the world's most vulnerable countries. Thus, we affirm.
Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay. So, you would agree that investments in buying bonds in developing countries is probably a pretty risky investment, right?
It's riskier than buying bonds for the U.S. government, yes.
Okay. And why do people buy U.S. bonds?
Because they're a safe asset.
Because they're safe. So why would someone invest, if people are investing in U.S., if these bonds are so risky,
yeah.
why are they
so
investing in them?
our argument is that these investors are already investing in these riskier bonds in emerging markets, but if we continue to borrow and increase the supply of American bonds, then these investors now pull out of these emerging markets and turn to America and buy those bonds, which will especially have
why wouldn't they, but if they care so much about risk, then why couldn't they invest in other safe investments?
They diversify their investments. Can I have a question?
Wait, what?
They diversify their investments.
But there are a lot of things you can invest in.
Before you ask me now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so how soon is a recession going to happen soon?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask another question?
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
Okay, so on interest rates, the last 40 years, what's happened to the U.S. debt?
Increased.
Yeah. What about our interest rates?
Increased.
No, our interest rates have gone down.
We would say that's probably short term.
No, it's not short term. The increase.
Or?
Well, hold on. You just said that the interest rates are increasing in the short term. That's true, but that's not because of the debt. The reason that the interest rates have gone from 0 to 2.5% recently is because of the business cycle, because we've been
Okay.
growing from the longest period of time ever.
Yeah,
But in the long term,
Ryan will
interest
bring it
rates
up
have
in
gone
rebuttal.
down.
Can I have a question?
Wait, but hold on.
Wait, that's
If
not a
interest rates,
question.
but
You're
yes,
just giving me a
so
response.
I'm asking you a question. So insofar as high debt has meant lower interest rates, that means that there's no correlation between debt and interest rates,
And
right?
we would disagree, and we would say that in the last several years, like from 1971 to 2012, Sebula said that a 1% increase in deficit spending has
No,
increased interest rates.
You're a Sebula
Can I have
evidence,
a-
but
can I have
that's a
question,
projection.
Ryan?
But that's not what's
No.
happening in reality.
No, can I have a question? Okay, then bring it up in
Yeah,
a
sure.
later
Go ahead.
speech. Okay. So, what happens if our debt continues to increase? Aren't we gonna have to pay more interest payments?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
also, well,
if that interest payments crowds out our ability to spend on like automatic stabilizers in the future, isn't that a lot worse?
Well, so we would
During
argue,
the expansion
yes,
right
we would
now?
argue a few things. One, the debt is going to get easier to pay back because the interest rates are going down. Two, the economy is growing because of is going to grow because of the AI revolution.
Okay, on
meaning
that,
we
what
have
is
so
the
much
bright
more-
light for AI?
What do you mean with
Like
bright light?
when is it gonna suddenly boom? Like we've
Pretty
been working
soon,
on AI.
our
What
CNBC
is pretty
evidence,
soon?
so
We've been
our
working on
CNBC,
AI for a while, right?
our CNBC evidence indicates that over the next 2 decades, the economy will double.
In the next 2 decades.
Yes, in 20 years, the
Okay,
economy
so what
will
if
double.
by then our debt we default on our debt or
Well, we won't,
or
because that's much
wait,
faster.
Can I finish my question? Okay. So what if by then interest payments crowd out our ability to pay for automatic stabilizers?
Well, the
What
rate,
happens then?
the rate, well, A, we would say we should borrow more, but even beyond that, that rate of growth is far faster than the debt is growing.
We disagree.
And let's start at the top. A big observation. If we win our case, we win my opponent's case, and also the round. The reason why is because cutting entitlements, as we have explained, destroys the social safety net of America, and A, makes recessions and depressions more likely, but B, also makes it harder to climb out of recessions. Remember our Ray evidence. Ray finds that 6 out of the last depressions were immediately preceded by debt reduction, because when you cut entitlements, you cut the spending of the poor, they lose their jobs, they lose that safety net. But our Washington Post evidence furthermore indicates that when you cut automatic stabilizers, it becomes much harder to climb out of recessions because no money is being injected into the economy. Here's how that outweighs my opponent's case. My opponent's case is entirely about economic recessions and harms in the developing world. Well, recessions and depressions in the US spill over into the developing world. In fact, the World Bank finds that the last recession in 2008 spilled over to the developing world to such a degree that hundreds of millions of people were forced into poverty. Not only does this link into my opponent's case, but it also outweighs their case on magnitude and time frame. Because you're comparing debt crises in isolated countries to a global depression that spills over to many other nations. But you're also comparing a short-term to long-term problem. Because even though the debt crisis in these countries may be bad, it certainly isn't long-term. As their example from 1997 explains, it sure harmed these economies, but these economies eventually recovered. However, a depression where we cannot get out of because there's a lack of stimulus, we cannot recover out of, and is a long-term impact. Now let's go to my opponent's case. Let's start at the top of their case with their Wall Street Journal evidence where they say that lots of nations are in global debt crises. This is true, but there is alternate causality. It is not because the US is paying more in debt. It is because of other historical events. Namely, in 2008, the US Federal Reserve dropped the interest rates on dollars, and as a result, these countries took out a lot of loans on dollars to finance mainly commodity purchasing. For example, Nigeria increased their exports of lumber. The problem was that commodity prices have been raising for the past couple of years. So according to The Guardian, the biggest reason why these countries are facing so much debt is because their loans didn't pay off, and now they're in these debt crises. So whether or not the US would have high debt or not, they still would have to pay off these excessive loans. Now let's go a little further. They give up the 1997 crisis. But this crisis sounds very bad, but there's no way to compare what's going on right now to that crisis. Simply put, they don't give you a brink of impact. They don't say how much higher the US debt has to be to cause these crises. Furthermore, the fact that the US debt was so low back then probably shows that there is no correlation between US debt and the harms in these countries. Now let's go to their individual warrants. Their first warrant talks about the increasing in investment. There's 2 problems here. First off, I would contend that because these countries have already lost payments through things like commodity purchases, that makes investing in them highly risky, because we've seen that already the loans that they took out do not pay off. So even if US debt was lower, even if people were not buying US bonds, they probably would not be buying the bonds of these countries. But 2, to win their first link, they have to win their second link. Because what we explain is that if interest rates still drop, these countries don't have to raise their own interest rates. And they can offer very low interest rates, which makes it easier to attract and finance buyer. So they have to win their second link to win the first one. Let's go to their second link. In their second link, they claim that US interest rates are going up, and thus it makes those countries raise their own interest rates. There's 2 issues. First, that is not true in the short term. In the short term, the Federal Reserve raises or lowers rates to respond to the business cycle. They raise rates to slow economic activity to prevent overheating, and lower rates to speed up economic activity in a recession. No relation to debt. But in the long term, as Noah points out in Crossfire, and according to Stein in 2018, there's been a 40-year drop in interest rates, even though the amount of debt that we've accrued has increased, showing that, again, there is no link between debt and interest rates. If anything, high debt has lowered interest rates, because it showed that even though the U.S. is taking on more debt, we have the capacity to take on more debt, allowing us to keep, allowing investment confidence to remain. What this means is it turns their arguments, because all their stats about a 1% increase in deficit, raising interest rates, are theoretical. They say if interest rates were to go up, this is what would happen. But insofar as interest rates have gone down and will continue to go down, they lose their link. In fact, I would contend that trying to lower the U.S. debt would probably raise interest rates, because to lower the debt, we would have to harm our economy by cutting entitlements. That makes our debt fundamentally more risky to investors, and they might demand higher interest rates. So if anything, the link between them cutting the debt and them lowering interest rates is not clear, and at best, it should not be voted on. Thank you, and please take it.
Like the rest of them, I also have some thank yous, and since I have to go last, that means they basically covered a lot of the thank yous I was going to give. But there's still a few that are important to me. The first is my mom, who comes to every tournament with me. It's the reason that we are able to travel, our chaperone at all times, and you've really just done so much for us. Thank you, Mom. I love you. Then to Corey Lane, Brophy, the two teams we work with, you guys have done wonders, not just for the amount of work I have to do, because now I can actually have time to do my homework, but also you guys are always just so enjoyable at tournaments, and it's been a really fun time with all of you. And to all the other people who have made this debate community such a great thing for me and Sreya, I greatly appreciate it. Then to you guys, as Noah said, this is our second time debating in finals. It's also our 5th time debating this year, so we see him quite often, unfortunately. But yeah, thank you for, I wouldn't want to debate finals against anyone else. And finally, or not finally, second finally, to Kale, our coach, who we already shipped him back to Utah, so he's on a flight right now, but he's done so much for us, and as Sreya said, is the most dedicated coach that anyone could ask for. Finally to Sreya, who joined debate just last year and has since just dedicated a good portion of her weekends to traveling around and debating, and thank you so much for that. Is everyone ready? I'm actually going to start on my own case first. Let's talk about their response to our case. They say that cutting entitlements are going to destroy the social net and cause a depression. I would say the longer we wait, the more entitlements we have to cut, which means that we are always going to come first, because there's a higher probability now that if we cut a limited amount of our budget, that it actually works and reduces the debt. We've seen instances of this. They give you their own example that when Clinton, for example, had a gradual cut, you saw over the long term a surplus for 3 years, which means it's definitely possible. Prefer that over their Europe example, because it's actually applied to America. Let's go to the top of my case. They give a few responses here. First, they say there's other historical problems. They say after the 2008 recession, these companies loaded up in debt, but that's the point. They've already loaded up in debt. There's no going back. All we can do right now is stop them from defaulting. The Zumbrun 18 evidence says that while 45% of developing nations are on the brink of default right now, it's not inevitable. We can stop the train from colliding if we stop the issuance of debt right now. They say we don't have a brink of impact, but this is our brink of impact. If we let the status quo continue, the issuance of debt is already driving up interest rates and leaving investment flows, which is why they're losing $5 billion every single week. Then they say 2 responses to our first warrant. First, they say that countries have other problems because of other loans and things like that, and because of commodity prices. But that's not true, because what Wilson 18 writes is that while this may have been true 10, 20 years ago, these emerging markets have shifted away from basic inelastic commodities and instead shifted to things like technology, which is why commodity prices aren't a problem anymore. Now all we have to do is ensure that they don't default on their debt. Their second response is that our first argument is about interest rates and contingent on interest rates. That's not true. Even if interest rates don't go up or go down, what happens is because treasuries are always safer, when the supply of treasuries increases, more capital is taken away from the rest of the global bond market, which is why emerging markets right now are losing $5 billion every single week. Let's go to their case. At the top, they read 2 reasons that the debt doesn't matter, both contingent on the debt to GDP ratio. The first is that the borrowing cost is on the decline. There's 2 problems here. First, PSEC 18 writes, if you look right now our 10-year treasuries are at a 7-year high because of the fact that our influx of debt under Trump's tax plan has driven up interest rates. And Sabula 14 says that in the history of America, when you analyze the actual interest rates and deficits and control for variables, which is why our evidence is better than theirs, we find that a 1% increase increase in deficits leads to a 0.21% increase in interest rates. While yes, it may be true that throughout history our economy is getting better, so there are decreases in interest rates, the problem is we are isolating the effect that deficits have. But then they say that there's going to be an automation boom. Let's talk about this. Even if there's an automation boom, our debt is growing too fast. Black 18 writes that our debt is rising 36% faster than our economy. Even if we double GDP by 2030, or in 2 decades as they say, this is 36% higher every single year. Black says that this compounds itself, which is why economic growth has never been able to reduce our debt even through periods when we have the productivity boom under the dot-com bubble. But more importantly, what Thompson 17 writes, that there isn't going to be an automation boom anyways because investment is at the lowest level since World War II in technology, and the warrant for this is that he finds that this low level of investment is simply not enough to sustain an automation boom. If you want an automation boom, you vote for us, because the Japan Times writes that actually high levels of debt crowd out private investment as people shift their investment because of the fact that the debt takes in investment and soaks out capital from the private bonds. But go to their first contention and only contention about entitlements. Cuts are inevitable. What the Peterson Foundation writes that right now interest rates are rising and our principals rising leads you to higher interest payments. Code 16 says that in 10 years, interest payments are going to take up 99% of our budget alongside mandatory spending, which is why the Peterson Foundation writes that your choice is simple. You cut now at 1.9% or you wait 5 years, in which case the cuts rise by 21%. But they say that cutting spending is going to cause a depression. That's not true. What Mitchell 10 writes is that when government debt actually lowers economic growth because it drives up interest rates, preventing companies from having any access to private capital, which is why Sousa says a 1% increase in government spending lowers private investment by 1.8%, which is why Bocha 13 writes that our debt puts 11,000 people with less income every single year.
All right. Everyone ready? Cool. So my first question for you is, you claim that interest payments will swallow up the budget and force entitlement cuts eventually, right?
Yeah.
So if the tax base is expanded because the economy grows, then that higher tax revenue can be used to pay off those debts, right?
Wait, like specifically what we are telling you is that the current trajectories are unsustainable. What we do right.
We can debate about if the economy solves for the debt later, but
Yeah.
I'm just asking you a simple question, right? If the tax base grows and the economy grows and the GDP ratio drops, we can pay for these programs.
Well, it would have to grow by a significant amount.
Sure, we can
right?
talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm
Like,
just
so
asking-
like I'm saying that like yes, in theory, if you increase the tax base by like over 40% for every single year for the next 20 years, I suppose you would be able to counteract this with growth. We've never seen this happen. Throughout, we've seen high levels of expansion, high levels of economic growth now. We haven't seen the debt to GDP ratio go down. Can I have a question?
We have seen this happen. We give the example of World War II. After innovation, after World War II, we reduced the debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure you can give me an example before we took our dollar off the gold reserve, but on the stopped pegging the dollar to gold. I'm sure you can give me an example from 9 years ago. But for the past 30 years, we've seen productivity booms due to technology. As you say, we've seen the debt to GDP ratio skyrocket, which is why we are at the point today. Can I have a question? Okay, let's talk about your idea that says that lower levels of economic growth as a result of cutting leads to, on net, like a decrease in revenue, right? So when we cut government spending, what happens to the private sector in terms of investment?
So this is your argument about crowd out, right?
Yeah,
That
sure.
private sector investment is good. Sure. So we would contend that government spending on entitlements is more productive for the economy than private sector investments.
Wait, why?
Why? Because the investments that you're talking about specifically often go towards unproductive things like stock buybacks or big companies.
Wait, okay, so like 2 things here, bro. Like one, like I'm sure that all private spending that is crowded out does not go to like stock buybacks. There's a very small sector of total like on net private spending, right, Daniel? Like if you decrease private spending by like 1.8%, it's probably across the board.
Yeah, obviously not all of it, but we're saying that the majority of this goes to less productive investments than to entitlements, which go directly towards American citizens. Another example is that big companies will just use that saved revenue to increase their own salaries. It's the same reason why income inequality and trickle-down economics don't work. That when you give rich people more money, it does not necessarily flow down to the people.
Sure, we'll contest that, but do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, this is the huge debate about economic theories, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. So you say that when you control for variables, when you raise the deficit, you lower interest rates, right? So if that were true, why is the interest rate been falling?
The interest rate hasn't been falling. The PSEC evidence specifically indicates that due to Trump's tax cut that ballooned our deficit and the spending that you talk about, the top of our case, our treasury yields are at a 7-year high as a result.
Okay, but that is about short term, right? The only reason why higher
that's
debt,
about long-term maturities. Like your analysis about interest rates falling is the short-term maturity.
The only reason why debt would increase interest rates is if confidence goes down. You have to
Wait,
money
no,
tax
that's
cuts
not
lowers
true.
confidence.
In the loanable funds market, an increase in demand for borrowing from the government is definitionally going to lead to higher interest rates.
Not if people are attracted to U.S. bonds anyway. That's fine.
Okay. Starting out on our argument about entitlement cuts, AI, their case. Let's start off on entitlements. Remember that the reason that the debt is growing so much right now is because there's an increase in spending on entitlements. That means that if you want to significantly reduce the debt, you have to cut entitlements, and you have to cut them by trillions of dollars. That is bad because A, our evidence at the bottom case indicates that just Social Security keeps 26 million people out of poverty, but B, we need to fund entitlement programs because they act as automatic stabilizers and get us out of recessions. Winning us this argument wins the round, because even if they win, then investors are pulling out of some companies. Remember that the Great Recession pushed over 100 million people into poverty. Therefore, if you do not have these automatic stabilizers, we will not be able to get out of recessions in the future, and as a result, the economies of developing countries will not only be much worse than the 100 million people because they can never get out of the recessions. That is on scope and magnitude far greater than their short-term impacts of like small debt crises. But let's look at their response. At the top, they say, let's look at their responses. They first say that interest rates are going down and that high debt causes higher interest rates. That is just simply not true. Over the past 40 years, the debt has gone up, but interest has gone down. And here is the warrant. It comes from Zoffer of Harvard, who explains that because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, there is an infinitely high demand for dollars. And for that reason, people always want to purchase more treasury bonds. As a result, our interest rates are incredibly low. This takes out all of their arguments about crowding out social programs in the long term, because insofar as we can just borrow more money, we will never have to do that. Then let's go to AI. What we say is that that an AI revolution will cause massive growth that has never been seen before. It will cause our GDP to double. But then they say the revolution won't happen because we're at the lowest investment ever. But that does not make any sense. The economy has been growing for the second longest period ever. Clearly, private investment is good. But then on crowding out, we would argue that investment by the government is far better than private investments, because what Daniel explains in Cross, that investment by the government goes directly to the poor, while private investment mainly goes to stock buybacks. On their case, remember that it does not make sense for people to go to the developing world to buy U.S. bonds if they care about safe investments. If people are making unsafe investments now, they will still make unsafe investments, but if they want to make safe investments, they will do that anyways, and that is why we negate.
Is everyone ready? I'm going to start on weighing first, and then our case theories. So, they may say that they link into 100 million lives, but we would say that we first outweigh on time frame, because maybe there's a recession in 5 to 10 years from now. But right now there's a crisis in action with emerging markets, and the only way to act is by affirming, because we can cut the debt now and pass fiscal stimulus later, but if these countries default, then millions are affected. First, Zumban says that over 45% of low-income countries are on the brink of default, and NERB says that if these two countries do default, millions will go into poverty. But then they say it doesn't make sense. If safe investments or there's different investors who invest in safe or different assets. But we would say that they diversify their portfolios, because if there's an increase in supply and an increase on returns on these safe assets, then they pull out of emerging markets and shift back to the U.S. And history is on our side. Capretta says that if the supply of U.S. Treasury bonds increases, then the lenders for emerging markets decrease as they shift to the U.S. Patel says these emerging markets lose $5 billion a week, but then Edwards also says that if this global supply of capital shifts, then they can't find lenders. And that's especially bad because debt defaults are uniquely happening because of America increasing its debt, and they also can't pass fiscal stimulus to help get out of the recession because their currency no longer has value. at that point go to their case. First, they say like they can borrow more money infinitely, but they have a fixed capital pool. They're only interested like in a specific, the resources are limited. But then Sebula prefers Sebula, who says that a 1% increase in deficits leads to a 0.21% increase in interest rates, and that's better evidence because it controls for all variables and shows that history actually shows that an increase in debt has increased interest rates. But then Pasek also says that that our treasury yields are on a 7-year high and our interest rates are increasing. But then Thompson says that specifically to automation, that our evidence is specific to tech investment and it's too low, so it won't lead to a boom. But then Japan Times says that if you want to create automation, you prefer our side because investing in government bonds crowds out private investment as people don't buy private bonds. At that point, remember Clutter and Neville, you only have to cut 1.9% per year now. If you wait just 5 years, that's 21% higher. And so for those reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
People are buying less bonds in developing countries because they're unsafe, right?
I mean, like, so like these investors have diversified portfolios, right? So when the supply of safe bonds enter the market, they were traditionally seen as low risk, low reward.
Okay,
But now
so
the rewards are a lot higher.
So they want to go to safer investments.
Our warrant is talking about how there's already investors at
Yeah.
emerging markets, but now they're pulling out.
I understand.
because of
So
the
our
increase in
response
supply.
is
No.
that the reason that they're leaving is because these bonds are unsafe. So they would
No.
always go and
No.
invest in
No.
other markets.
So, like, let's
because
say
they're
like
safer
I'm an
investments.
emerging market investor and I diversify my portfolio. So I've like I'm a global bond investor. I've like half my money in treasuries and half in like the risky emerging markets with like higher interest rates, and thus I make higher returns on them. The problem is when interest rates and yields rise in America, then because of the increased supply of bonds, that results in a shift back to America,
Ryan,
which is
I
why history is
understand.
on our side. We've seen $5 billion
Ryan,
every week.
I understand your argument, but you are not responding to our warrant, which is that the reason that they are leaving is because they want to find safer investments. And if they want safer investments, they will do that no matter what.
No, Noah. Okay, two things. One, if the pool and supply of treasuries has not increased, they cannot buy a treasury because the supply has not increased. Two, the second reason is that the reason they make the calculated switch is because of the fact that the yields on treasuries are now higher, which is why they're at a 7-year high right now. But we've spent half of cross on this. Can I have a question?
Just to clarify, like we're not contesting that they buy less treasuries. We're contesting that the money that they save from treasuries goes towards developing nations. Just to
Wait,
clarify.
we're not saying that they'll go back to developing nations. We say they won't come back to treasuries. Like they're already in emerging markets right now. Can we have a question? Okay, so let's talk about this idea of like you guys having a recession sometime in the future. When is this recession going to happen?
Economists predict there will be one in 2 years.
So, like, why would there be a recession in 2 years?
Wait. The pro-ballot triggers the recession. Remember that 6 out of the last 7 times we reduced the debt is
Because-
caused
Wait,
into
A, that's just not in summary, and B,
Well, no,
why?
it
What is the
was.
warrant
Hold
for
on,
why
Ryan,
it causes
was.
recession?
The reason that it caused a recession is because a recession is just definitionally a period of less economic growth for 4
But why
consecutive
does
quarters.
reducing the
So
debt-
when you cut, because what you do when you cut the debt is you have to cut entitlement programs, which remember what we said keeps 26 million people out of poverty.
You
That's
also
just
give
social
every
security.
family $11,000, and that analysis is like not like completely dropped because even like you can tell me maybe like private investment, some of it goes like buybacks, but a majority of the investment goes towards things like creating jobs, creating like basic incomes for these families, so they don't need entitlements.
That's not true because most private investment is done by the wealthy, and most of the wealthy do things like stock
Yeah,
buybacks.
but, like,
But B,
wait.
our analysis, but Ryan,
That's a very
our
simplified
analysis
form of,
is
like,
that,
how
that
the-
100% of spending on entitlements, which is most of federal spending, goes directly to the poor.
Sure,
So
and
there's
creating
more of a
like
direct
creating
impact.
jobs and having a cascade effect where more people are employed also benefits the poor.
We're not saying private investment is always terrible. We're just saying when you're picking between $11,000 less in income versus a depression, which will kill like all
If
income,
everyone dropped
you
$11,000,
prefer
it would
you
be
prefer the
a
former.
recession.
Right. Is everyone ready? Great. Let's begin. Let's start on entitlement. This is where you can sign your ballot for the negative. Remember that the only way to substantially reduce the debt is to cut entitlements because they comprise the lion's share of the budget and the most vastly increasing share of the budget. That is important. If you cut entitlement spending, you deprive the poor of things like Social Security and Medicare, which means that they have a lack of a safety net, and which means that 26 million people who are out of poverty as a result of Social Security fall back in. It also makes the economy much worse because less money is being injected in. And 6 out of the last 7 times we have reduced the debt, it has predicted a recession very shortly for that same reason. But not only does it make recessions more likely, it also makes it impossible to get out of recessions because we can't stabilize or stimulate the economy. My opponents have dropped all of this. It is offense to us. this wins us the round, because it wins us in a couple of ways. First off, it outweighs on magnitude, because they're talking about localized debt crisis, but ours is a globalized depression, because the U.S., a crisis that starts in the U.S. will always go global because of interconnected activity. But two, my opponents talk about time frame, but their time frame may come a little, but first off, the time frame doesn't come more immediately, because we say that almost immediately after you reduce the debt, it predicts a next recession, but we also outweigh on the long term, because even if theirs comes a little sooner, as we've established, their debt crises are fundamentally short term, like 1 in 97. But if we can't get out of depression, there is no way out. The tunnel has no light at the end. But third, we also link in because we make their problems a lot worse. Okay, let's address this issue of if we can keep on borrowing and this affects their term, right? So they say the cuts are inevitable, but this is only true if the U.S. does not have the ability to borrow money to pay for these things. And this is where the Zoffer explains. Zoffer explains that because the U.S. is the reserve currency, because T-bonds are traded in U.S. dollars, which buy all things like stocks and oil, there will always be a high demand for U.S. dollars, which means that we can always finance our debt. The only response they reach to this is that there is fixed capital. Sure, there is not infinite amounts of money in the world, but there is plenty enough to mean that we can still borrow into the future for the foreseeable future, which takes out their argument. Then they give this argument about crowd out, but it's not impacted out, even if there is some loss of capital. What we say is that public investments are much better spent on the whole because most of private investment goes towards buybacks. So on net, our impacts about development and depression outweigh. But finally, on their case, even if they win that less people are going to buy U.S. debt, they do not win that this means that they rescue poor countries because the investors who have left do not come back because they think that the investments in the poor countries are not paying off and they've already lost the loans. Thank you. Please negate the resolution.
Is everyone ready? I'm going to start on our case and then go to their case. Time starts now. They say that they're going to have a globalized depression, which is a lot worse. They miss what Shreyas says, which is that debt default crises are a very specific type of recession that is much worse because they aren't able to pass fiscal stimulus afterwards, which means that you should prefer debt defaults always before their analysis. Because if their currency goes moot because of a debt default, they cannot get themselves out of poverty. The Zumbrun evidence says that 45% of countries are on the brink of default right now. The NERB evidence says that if a single default happens, millions will fall into poverty. Their only response is that even if we increase or decrease the amount of debt, the investors who have left won't come back. That's new and final focus and not responsive to our argument. Our argument is that they are in these emerging markets right now, but they will leave if we let our debt continue to rise and let the trains collide. The Capretta evidence that doesn't go responded to says that when you increase the debt, you increase the amount of bonds on the market, which leads to a shift back to America. The Patel evidence gives you the history, which says that they lose $5 billion every single week right now. The Edwards evidence says that as the global capital pool shifts away from emerging markets, you see that these countries cannot find the lenders they need to pay off their deficits, which is why they, as a result, default and cause the impacts in our case. Remember, debt defaults are unique, not like their recession. But on their case, let's talk about why they're not winning the argument. First, extend the turn from the Peterson evidence that says we can cut 1.9% now, or you can wait 5 years and increase cuts by 21%. Their only response is because we are the reserve currency, we have a high level of demand. They miss what Shreyas says, which is that a 1% increase in deficits has historically led to a 0.21% increase in interest rates. Sure, there might be a high level of demand, but that demand is always constant. When the supply of bonds increases and prices of bonds fall and yields rise, that's when you find specifically that the interest costs rise a lot, which is why we find specifically that it's inevitable. It does not matter whether or not we have high levels of demand if the supply of bonds is rising so fast. Cuts are inevitable, entitlement cuts are inevitable, which means that we are controlling the internal argument in their case because they cut much worse. But then the analysis in the turn they drop is the Thompson evidence that says that technology right now is being invested at the record low level since World War II. Japan Times says that debt is crowding out our ability to invest in this technology, have the doubling of our GDP, which precludes any of the recession analysis because we solved for this automation boom, have a boom that brings us out of this recession.